So it's 6 o'clock, and David Barstow, our star guest for today, one of our highlights of the conference, is also there, very punctual. And I'm very pleased and happy to have you with us. You know, many of the people from the press councils, because we have invited you a couple of times. You have also been to Moscow one time, so we are in constant contact, so to speak, and I'm very happy that you will tell us about your new experience with your new job, but also with your students, and about the situation in the US on COVID-19, on Corona, and how the authorities dealt with this pandemic. Of course, it will be interesting to all of us because yeah, it's a pandemic, so we all have the same issues, and it will be interesting how investigative journalism can cover such unique and important event. So a warm welcome to you, David, and the floor is yours. You will give us some insight, you will deliver a speech, and after that we will have a chat. I will interview you, we have a conversation, and then of course people are also allowed to raise questions.
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. It's morning where I am here in sunny San Francisco. It's great to see you all again. Alex, I think maybe we should start first with the news of the day. So some of you, so I had, because it's relevant to this whole discussion. So I had the experience of being sued 2 days ago by Donald Trump.
Oh, really? Okay, that's very fresh news.
That's very fresh news, yes. Our former president sued myself and two of my reporting partners at the New York Times and the New York Times itself for $100 million.
You're a big fish, David.
I know, 100 million, yeah, oh dear. And this is not a libel suit. It's not a defamation suit. It's a lawsuit accusing us of engaging in what he described as an insidious plot to induce his niece, Mary Trump, to giving us thousands of pages of confidential financial records. And what Trump is claiming is that his niece was forbidden by a non-disclosure agreement from giving those documents to anyone, and what he's alleging about the New York Times and specifically about myself and my two reporting colleagues is that we improperly induced Mary Trump into breaking her contract with her uncle. And so he's accusing us of this under what the phrase is under the law is called tortious interference, and it basically means acting to induce someone to break a contract. And like the reason why this is really relevant to this larger conversation about journalism and in the moment, and certainly in the United States, in terms of talking about press freedom, is that if Trump were to succeed in this case, it would actually have a severe chilling effect on an awful lot of investigative reporting in this country. I mean, one thing that corporations and powerful interests have gotten, are using non-disclosure agreements more and more and more and more. It seems like everybody now has a non-disclosure agreement when you go to work at large entities. In fact, even Trump famously tried to got a number of White House officials to sign non-disclosure agreements as a condition of going to work for him in the White House. And so if he were to succeed in saying, well, any reporter who has a conversation with someone who's subject to a non-disclosure agreement, that anytime any conversation between a reporter and that person could be considered tortious interference, well, then that would shut off an awful lot of investigative reporting. So this is like, leaving aside certainly in our view that this is, certainly the view of the New York Times and my own view is that this is basically one more effort by Donald Trump to delegitimize reporting and the media, but B, I think it's also consistent and part of an overall effort that he's mounted for many, many years now to limit our rights as journalists to publish hard truths about powerful people like Donald Trump, and so I think that's something that we should be we're certainly, I'm sure in the United States, this will be viewed as an important test of some principles that have been in place for a long time. And so one of the core principles that exists in American journalism is that reporters are absolutely permitted under the law, right, to publish information that gets leaked to them, regardless of whether or not that information is covered by secrecy laws or it's covered by non-disclosure agreements. So long as you, the reporter, didn't give aid and advice to the person who is leaking on how to hack some computer or how to break the lock and get into some cabinet drawer or get into some office. If you're simply doing your job as a reporter and someone gives you information, even though they may have done something improper, they may have broken the law, they may have violated some non-disclosure agreement, you're perfectly within your rights to publish the information that you obtain, and all the more so if it's information that is clearly in the public interest. And so in this case, one of the biggest issues during the entirety of the Trump administration was about his financial entanglements, his taxes, his business practices, and so the story that he is suing us over, which is the story that we published in 2018, and it was a story that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize that year for explanatory reporting. That story really broke a ton of new important new ground about Donald Trump's financial history, and in particular some of the tax schemes that he and his family used to avoid many tens of millions of dollars in taxes. And so anyway, I just thought we should at least put that on the table since that just happened, and maybe we can see if there's any questions about that, and then we can go back to the main.
That's very
discussion.
good. Yeah, that's very good that you informed us on that, because it's Very interesting development, and I wanted to ask you anyway if you miss Trump because you made that big story on him, but you don't have to miss him now because he's now trying to get after you, so he's still there. So the question is done. But as you already said, I think first of all, the responsibility lies at the source who signed the contract and not at the journalist. I'm not an expert in US law and common law, but I would say that the obligation is connected to the one who signs that agreement and not to the journalist who is listening to the source. But that's just a general comment from my side. From my point of view of European law, so to speak. But of course, there is also a lot of pressure, even if you have the New York Times with you, it takes a lot of energy and effort to fight that proceedings. We have that problem in Austria that politicians tend to sue the journalists even if they don't have a good perspective to win it, but just to make them busy and to put some effort on them. And I think this development you have in the US as well, haven't you, David?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one important point here is that, and from my perspective, actually, it's a very central point, is that Donald Trump is actually not challenging the accuracy of a single fact of what we published. This was a 14,000 word story that was just packed with new details about his financial history, and so in an odd way, this lawsuit is sort of, if nothing else, is kind of saying, well, we don't like that you published the story. We think we can, we think that you acted improperly in getting the story, but we're not actually challenging the truth of the story. And so that's part of what makes this case kind of interesting, because typically, when cases are brought, they're brought for libel, they're brought for defamation, and it's someone arguing that you harmed my reputation. And
do you know if there is any case law which you could compare, or you haven't informed yourself too much, probably, if it's just 2 days ago that they started with the lawsuit?
Well, I know that there's a line of cases, there's a line of Supreme Court decisions that establish the sort of basic principle that I described a minute ago, that reporters are protected by the First Amendment in writing about documents that they obtained from sources, even if those sources violated a national security law or some other law or contract in providing those documents. So this is like, there are many cases of this. Obviously, like the New York Times wrote millions of stories about what came out from WikiLeaks. Edward Snowden, right? Again, the many publications all over the world were writing stories about the material that Ed Snowden clearly, improperly, illegally downloaded and stole from.
Sorry to interrupt you, but with Snowden, you could also argue that it was legal because it was in the public interest. Even though many Americans don't see it like that, but from a European perspective, you could put in that he informed the public, and so he was somehow justified, even if he broke the security laws. Yeah.
Well, so that defense doesn't work very well for the whistleblower.
Right.
In the U.S. context. I mean, people have tried it. I mean, many whistleblowers have, like people who consider themselves whistleblowers, have tried to make that defense, and it tends not to work for them, but it has worked for the journalists, and it has protected the journalists. So I think, I think that principle, though, is what is now being challenged by Trump's lawsuit against myself and my two reporter colleagues.
Yeah, but you have some case law with you, so to speak, on your side. So at least that's
yeah, but it's also a very different Supreme Court
that's true.
than it was just a few years ago.
Of course, that is also true. There was a lot of political changings, but yeah, still very interesting, but also, of course, quite some pressure on you and the Times.
We shall see. We shall see. But I think there's obviously a lot of pressure on investigative reporters all over the world, and this is just, I mean, certainly the pressure that we're enduring right now is nowhere near the pressure that we're seeing on reporters in unfortunately a growing number of countries, including some countries in Europe.
The very sad thing is that the pressure now comes also from politicians in the Western democracies. This is something new. We didn't have that, and that's quite a substantial change, I would say. Don't you agree, David?
I do. I think it's I think that the thing that we've seen very clearly is that Trump actually was very successful in with his slogan "Enemy of the People," in eroding support for press freedom in the United States. You can see it in poll after poll after poll after poll. Support for, like, the First Amendment, for the support for the idea of the free press has really plummeted. I mean, obviously, in particular among the members of his base, but there's a larger erosion that's occurring, and I think this is certainly of a piece, right, with the erosion that we're seeing in places like Brazil and certainly in Hungary and in a number of other places. And I think that that's something that should alarm all of us, and we should take it quite seriously. And so one of the reasons why I'm just wanting to highlight this lawsuit that Trump brought is, yes, okay, maybe it's you can sort of kind of try to laugh it off and say it's no big deal, and he's had a very he's had no luck whatsoever ever winning these cases against the media. But I don't look at it that way. I put it in the larger context of what he's been trying to do for many years now, and I think you have to say, well, he's had some significant success in moving public opinion, and I think the leadership that he showed in attacking press freedoms in the United States was kind of contagious. And you started seeing leaders in other countries adopting literally the identical language that he was adopting, the fake news idea, right? You see that being adopted and mimicked all over the globe, and I think that's something that we should, that's why I think it's relevant for this fabulous audience here to be aware of what just happened here in the United States, because it has a way of ultimately migrating to other parts of the globe.
Do you think that the problem is also very much related to social media, because you can somehow circumvent the classic media and the reliable media, and then the politicians play with that now?
So there's been an incredibly important series of stories that have been published in the Wall Street Journal over the last couple of weeks about Facebook, and describing how Facebook and the role it has played in amplifying disinformation and information that is affecting, for example, the mental health of young women in this country and around the world. But the overall theme of these stories and some other reporting that's come out in the last week is that the social media platforms have long known and know that the problem is much worse than they've told the public, and they've really done almost nothing at all to try to combat this. And it's because their business model is built around engagement and eyeballs and clicks. And so the content that is being generated, I think there was a story yesterday, I'm not sure if it was the Wall Street Journal or it was maybe the Washington Post, that there's new research that shows that something like 140 million Americans a month were seeing content on Facebook that was being generated by troll farms in Eastern Europe. 140 million Americans a month were and this was content that Facebook and its algorithms were pumping to Americans. It wasn't like, these weren't like 140 million Americans clicking on or choosing or selecting content from these troll farms. And what was really awful about this story was that Facebook researchers themselves had identified this and were writing urgent memos to the leadership of Facebook saying, hey, look at what is happening here. This is terrible. This is not what we're about. And Facebook took no steps whatsoever to actually combat this. And so this obviously relates to this conversation here, because it's not just that social media platforms are like the perfect delivery device for misinformation and disinformation, but it's actually worse than that. It's not just that they're a delivery device, it's that they are working really hard to actually amplify disinformation because it is helpful to their bottom line. And so it's been well documented, of course, the close relationship between like Donald Trump's campaign and Facebook. He was brilliant at exploiting Facebook's data on all of us to target messages to voters all across the United States in both 2016 and in 2020. And so I do think that it's the combination of these attacks on journalists combined with the ease in which politicians and other business elites are able to spread nonsense and disinformation and propaganda with like the flick of a switch, and then count on Facebook and Google and YouTube and Instagram and Twitter and Parler and Telegram. They can count on WhatsApp to just spread this nonsense and propaganda like wildfire. And we all know that it takes an incredible amount of effort to reveal the lie and to show what's true and what's false. And it always takes truth longer to catch up to the lie. And so when you have this dynamic combined with, and maybe this comes to the conversation that I had intended to have this morning about COVID and the new wave of collaboration in journalism. But what this also combines with, of course, is that COVID had a devastating impact on our newspapers and our news outlets. Obviously it had a devastating economic impact globally, but it certainly resulted in many, many thousands of layoffs from newsrooms all over this country over the last 18 months. And so that's meant that the people who are out there trying to get to facts their ranks are thinning. You have rising attacks from people like Trump, and then you have social media just pumping out the propaganda and the BS. I guess you guys know what BS means, right? And so that's what makes our job, that's what's making our job all the more difficult and tricky and daunting.
Yeah, before we continue, I just want to cite Olga. She wrote in the chat that we sent you a lot of vibes of support and strength. So
hi Olga, how are you? I know Olga well. How are you, Olga? Good to see you.
Good, thanks. I'm so glad I made it. I left my students earlier. We managed to finish our work earlier to get to your talk. Thanks, David.
So you have all the support we can give you. Of course, we don't have money to finance your lawsuit, but we back you up as good as we can. Yeah. So.
Yes. Yeah. I'll give you my Venmo account here at the end of this.
Yeah, when I was preparing for our talk, I found a citation by you. You said we are in a contest between a world of truth and a world of lies.
Yes.
You mentioned that now also. I just want to ask you, who will win, or how is it possible to overcome that situation and to fight that lies and to convince the general public that that trustful information is the right way to go for?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I left the New York Times and I came to Berkeley to teach at the Graduate School of Journalism is, I really feel like truth, the idea of a society built and based around truth, it desperately needs reinforcements. It needs more young people to take up the challenge of confronting a world built around lies. In fact, I just met yesterday with a young journalist from Serbia who is visiting here at Berkeley, and he runs the largest, I guess the only fact-checking site in Serbia. And he went on television to talk about the problem of disinformation. And he said on TV in Serbia that the largest source of disinformation in Serbia was this state-run Serbian broadcaster. And the very next day, he was sued for defamation by the Serbian broadcaster, which is, I guess, at the time was government owned and operated. He was describing the terrible toll that it took on him and his organization to have to defend this lawsuit and to show and to demonstrate that actually, yes, in fact, the Serbian national news outlet is indeed like pumping out total nonsense. It's like it's up is down and down is up, and the sky is green and the moon is square. And when you look around the world, you see those kinds of absurdist narratives taking root. Of course, we we're living through a very vivid example of that with the pandemic, and with certainly here in the United States, the consequences of people thinking that COVID is fake, and that it's a plot, and that it's you know, that the vaccines are a plot, and you know, that this is all an effort to the government is secretly trying to control you and poison you. You know, we've seen with our own eyes the consequences of that. A lot of people have paid with their lives because of how widely that idea spread certainly in parts of the United States, and I presume in other places around the world. And so when this question of who is going to win, just to be really brutally honest about it, if I were a betting man,
yeah,
and I had to place a wager on this, clearly at the moment you'd have to put your money on lies winning out, because of the combination of things that I just described, the combination of the social media platforms being the perfect delivery amplification device, the business troubles of actual journalism, and the increasing number of politicians and political leaders and business leaders to try to delegitimize the value and the importance of having a free press. And so the thing about investigative reporters is we're kind of hopeless romantics, and we're hopeless optimists. And so even though I think that the odds are against us, I'm going to do everything in my power here at Berkeley to try to encourage as many smart, young, passionate people as possible to fall in love, not just with journalism, but even more so in my case, with investigative reporting. And the good news that I can report is that we have a lot of those people flocking to us and really hungry to do this work. Because I think a lot of people recognize that it's awful to live in a society that is built around 1 + 1 = whatever the dear leader says it equals. Who wants to live in that kind of world, right? And so we're seeing some really amazing young people come here. I'm working with just really impressive kids who know that they know that the odds are stacked against them. They know that journalism doesn't pay a lot of money. They know that there are a lot of layoffs happening in newsrooms. They know that that journalists are often attacked and reviled, and they know all of that, and yet they're racing here to Berkeley and to other schools, certainly in the United States, and they're saying, "Hey, coach, put me in. I'm all in." And all they want to do is they want to learn how to do this. They're desperate to learn how to do this, and I guess that maybe connects back to the thing that I meant to talk about, which is that COVID actually gave us a really great opportunity to get our students directly involved in producing very meaningful journalism, not just for the college newspaper, but actually for the New York Times and for the LA Times and for our any number of other publications around the country. And in part, it's because we've seen an ever greater willingness of news organizations to collaborate, not only with each other, but also with journalism school programs like the one that I run here at Berkeley. And in part, it's because there are financial difficulties. And so everyone wants content, and everyone wants more reporters, and we have a small army of reporters. When the pandemic hit in March of last year here in California, I got together with a few of my colleagues here at Berkeley, and we just said, let's scrap all of our ideas about teaching and all of our classes, and let's just turn this school into a newsroom that is going to be devoted to covering like a once in a lifetime enormous story, the pandemic. Because of course I had worked for 20 years at the New York Times, and they knew me, we quickly formed an alliance with the New York Times, and within a week we had a newsroom of 80 student reporters working in teams covering every single county in California, and tracking how the pandemic was affecting, obviously on the health side, but also on the economic side, and in all the really complicated ways that the pandemic affected people, certainly in the state of California. And before you know it, we've published, we've had dozens of stories published in the New York Times, written and reported by my students. We've had 9 of my students have been on page 1 of the New York Times. And then a funny thing happened, which was once other publications saw what we were doing, they were like, wait a minute, why are you only giving stories to the New York Times? Why won't you give them to us too? And so we've now published the investigative reporting program, which I run. We've now had published over 130 articles in dozens of different news outlets around the country. And we're not the only ones doing this, by the way. The Northwestern University, which is a very fine journalism school, they teamed up with the Washington Post and produced some really groundbreaking work about especially the toll of the pandemic in nursing homes around the country. Other journalism schools have also been forming alliances and partnerships and collaborations with this sort of established traditional news media outlets around the country. And so I think this is part of a much larger trend that's happening in journalism towards more and more collaboration between news outlets. The old idea that we're just all competing against each other and we'll kill each other before we say good morning. Like that idea, I think, is rapidly melting away. And it's not just, I don't think it's just about in response to the business difficulties. I also think it's in response to this sense that we as an idea, we as a profession, that we are collectively under pressure and are under assault. And boy, we better band together if we're gonna have a hope of turning the tide here. And so I think that's another reason. And then I would say the second reason this is happening is because there's a recognition, in particular, that we certainly in the United States, that we have to help young people learn how to do this kind of work and to do it well. And so I think, and not only young people in general, but actually more specifically, we really have to work harder to make our newsrooms reflect the full diversity of our country. And investigative reporting in the United States for a very long time has been dominated by white men like me. And there's a recognition that that has been very much to the detriment of this country, that we've missed an awful lot of stories because our investigative reporting units did not have enough women and people of color in them to help us see and recognize and report stories about, for example, police brutality and other kinds of stories. So all of those forces, I think, are pushing this new collaborative spirit forward, and I think it's going to continue to be a trend, certainly in the United States, and I hope it's a trend that takes root in Europe. I don't know. Has it taken root, Alex?
As far as I know, in Austria, there are investigative teams. I mean, we don't have so much investigative journalism anyway because of a lack of resources. But the media outlets, they try to cooperate, and I also through this international associations, like with the Panama Papers and all these kind of things. They try to collaborate also with the German big news outlets. So there is a trend towards cooperation. And as far as I can see, investigative journalism changes quite a bit, because I remember that once you told me investigative reporting can be a very lonely work. But nowadays, probably it's more team-oriented, and it has changed substantially, I suppose. You were also telling that to us just before.
It's definitely more team-oriented, in part because of how I mean, maybe in part because of the fact that so much investigative reporting these days is very multimedia oriented, right? So it's not just like I'm a writer, right? I'm not a photographer. I don't know how to do graphics. I don't know
video editing.
And the best investigative reporting that you see, and more in just daily, regular reporting, you're just seeing these pieces that are very multimedia in their kind of DNA. And so then that requires collaboration, and it requires teamwork. And I think that one of the things that's happened in the United States in the last couple of years has been a big shift, is the rise of what we call visual investigations. And so this would be like the stuff that you see coming from like Bellingcat in Europe, the stuff that they did documenting like Russian government agents poisoning Navalny. That technique we call open source investigations, and which is pioneered by Bellingcat, but also there was a small company in Ireland that led the way on this. In fact, the New York Times hired somebody away from that company in Ireland, a guy named Malachi Brown, who's one of the leading pioneers in this field called visual investigations. And so now you're seeing the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA, you're seeing all these news organizations rushing to build visual investigation units that are focused on delivering kind of these authoritative reconstructions using satellite imagery, using all kinds of geolocation tricks to deliver like definitive accounts of, like, for example, the murder of Khashoggi in the embassy in Turkey, and so that idea, and in fact, one of the groups that is really a pioneer in visual investigations is the Human Rights Center right here at Berkeley. So I'm actually teaching right now with the head of the Human Rights Center in Berkeley, where we're trying to basically merge the kind of visual investigation techniques with the kind of old school traditional investigative reporting techniques that I know, And I think that that's going to be something that's going to emerge in newsrooms around the country. You know, a really good example of this is, well, everyone remembers, of course, the murder of George Floyd, who was suffocated on the street corner in Minneapolis by a group of police officers. So the New York Times sent members of its visual investigations team to Minneapolis right after this George Floyd's death, but they also sent like regular reporters to Minneapolis. And so the regular reporters, you know, all descended on the neighborhood, and they looked for witnesses, and they started asking about the disciplinary records of these police officers and their police training. And the visual investigations team also, though, went to the same neighborhood, only what they did was they went to every store on the street and asked them, do you have any surveillance video? And in fact, it turned out that there was all kinds of surveillance video that was being taken by these stores in that same neighborhood. And so they were able to put together this sort of video reconstruction of what happened with George Floyd. But both of those things sort of didn't connect, right? There was the visual investigation, and then there was sort of what the traditional investigative reporters were doing, but they didn't really connect in one story. And I think what we're going to start to see, though, is it seems to make obvious sense for these two disciplines to kind of come together and support each other and figure out new ways of telling stories together. And so that's what we're working on here at Berkeley, is we're working on exactly that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, David.
Problem.
Could you maybe tell us a bit more on your Corona and COVID investigation and the outcome? Did you find any deficiencies of the authorities? How did your students react? I suppose it was also not so easy to do it due to the various lockdowns, so people could not go out on the field too much, probably.
Well, we had to, I mean, yeah, we had to, I'm sure you guys have had to deal with the same issues, but we did, we were very cautious about sending our reporters out. We did extensive safety training with them. We had a whole protocol where before anyone went out and interviewed anyone, they had to make an application to me as the editor, and we had conversations about, why is this necessary? Is there some other way we can do this? Do we really have to go? And we made sure that our reporters, our students had the correct safety equipment, and had training about how to do this kind of reporting safely. And in fact, we did end up sending people out. A lot of people. There was a lot of on the ground reporting that ultimately that was done. And our reporters surfaced all kinds of really important stories that ended up running in the New York Times. We were writing about one of the things that emerged, for example, very quickly was our students did one of the first stories about the rise of harassment and hatred aimed at Asian Americans. And our because we're in San Francisco, we were really close to that story. And we were one of the first to write stories about this sudden uptick that obviously as more and more members of the public began blaming anyone who was Asian for this pandemic. Our students also did some of the first stories about the fact that migrant farm workers in California were being especially hard hit. They were not getting the protections that many other workers. This is like the kind of the beginning of the stories that we started to see about the meatpacking industry being an area where a lot of people were made sick because of the working conditions. And we did some of those early stories about the migrant farm workers in the Central Valley of California. We did a page one story for the New York Times that documented how the people who investigate child abuse claims in California, because they were afraid of COVID, they were no longer going out and doing interviews and looking at children and looking to see whether they were bruised and beaten, because they were afraid to knock on doors and go in, and they weren't being given the safety equipment to do this kind of work safely. So we've done a whole range of stories that have pulled back layers of how the pandemic has affected people across the California, and I think that, you know, I mean, I'll say this, it's always a wonderful thing to hear an editor come and say to you, hey, your story is going to be on page one of the New York Times tomorrow, right? That's always a wonderful sentence to hear. But when I got the call from the national editor of the New York Times to tell me, hey, your students are going to be on page one of the New York Times tomorrow, I think that was actually the happiest I've ever felt in journalism. It was such a kick to imagine. Can you imagine you go to journalism school and you're like going to learn journal, and then you end up on the front page of the New York Times? Can you imagine what that would feel like? That was a great feeling. But what it did was, it's made a bunch of my students fall head over heels, madly, hopelessly in love with this, and so that's what we're all about.
Right. So my last question before we open up to the audience is, do you miss the New York Times? Do you miss the investigative reporting? I mean, of course, you won't miss it too much because you're still doing it, but in a different way. So is this new way more interesting to you because it's a change for you, it's a challenge, and you work with the students, you give your knowledge to them? That's always nice. Is this something you like better now? It's change.
So one thing I really like about my new role is that I actually now get to collaborate and talk to and communicate with a whole range of great journalists, not just at the New York Times, but at all these are people whose work I've admired for many, many years. And now in this new role that I'm in, I'm like working with them and teaming up with them. I mean, someone who's been a longtime hero of mine is a guy named Ron Nixon, who runs the investigative unit at the Associated Press. And so now I'm teaming up with Ron on a story right now. When I worked at the New York Times, of course, we had a huge rivalry with the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. But now, I'm working with those journalists, and I'm really enjoying that part. And I think it's because it goes back to the point that we were talking about a minute ago, because I feel like we are in this large global kind of contest between a world of facts and truth and a world of lies. I think that I can do more good if I'm able to pull in, and train and make, 500 young people fall in love with investigative reporting over the next decade. I feel like that long term will have a much bigger impact in this struggle that we're all engaged in than if I had just continued to write stories for the New York Times. So of course, yes, I have dear friends there. I'm still working with them. but I feel very, very happy in this new role. It feels right, and it feels like exactly the place that I want to be in this struggle that we're all in right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for this very, very interesting insight in your new work, and also in the situation of the United States, and in the situation of freedom of the press on a global level, so to speak. So, are there any questions from the audience?
I have one. Sorry to hide my last name, Joe Gunset. I'm in between practicing law right now. David, an old friend of Alex. I guess your mention of Facebook occurred to me. I was a journalism student at Fordham and grew up with a respect for the New York Times and reading it from a very young age. But one of the frustrations I have is with young people who don't read newspapers, who rely on what comes across their Facebook feed, and some older people as well. And you know, I encourage all the young people that I speak with to. So the three newspapers I subscribe to and read regularly are the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And I've sent out on family Zoom, we have this family Zoom chat, and I've sent out lists of Pulitzer Prizes won by major newspapers. And I said, this is who you read. This is what you read. This is what you subscribe to. And don't rely on your Facebook feed or whatever. Go directly to the newspapers' websites, read their websites, read what you can rely upon is directly from the source, and subscribe. And I know the New York Times gives free subscriptions and discount subscriptions and does all kinds of things, but and I have to admire and respect tremendously what you do now, and what you've done in your career is just tremendous, and I think we all have great admiration for it. The challenge that I worry about, I think a lot of people worry about, is, you know, what happens with the next generation? How do you influence the kids in high school to read newspapers and to grow up with a greater respect for journalism? Because the disrespect for journalism that I see all across our society is just absolutely appalling. And of course, the nonsensical, you know, conspiracy theories regarding the New York Times and other folks, it's just and other major publications, it's shocking, and it's very worrisome, because you know, if you have wonderful talent at these institutions, and I know the New York Times has a great endowment, etc., what happens if no one is paying attention? That's where I have the fear. I don't know if you know of work that's being done, or work that we should do as good citizens, or what? Yeah,
I mean, I think you just described the problem very well, and there's definitely an issue with, and I see it in my students, that well, first of all, none of them are reading newspapers, right? And I mean, no one goes out and buys a newspaper. I mean, no one under 25 goes out and actually purchases a newspaper anymore. But even like making, like, the idea of like reading on their phone, reading like an article, or reading more than a few hundred words of an article, for kids, you know, I mean, they don't even have phone calls with each other anymore. I mean, they, like, the idea of having telephone calls is sort of like too much for them. They're all like, it's all text messages, and it's little like short bursts of, and I actually see it in I mean, I can see the consequences of this when my students come back from doing interviews, and I'm realizing, okay, their interviews are in some cases just as superficial as their text message exchange that they're having with their best friends. You know, LOL, you know, it's, and so I'm always like pushing, I'm always like trying to encourage my students to like really embrace the idea of like long conversations, sources to like, so that you can get to the truth of things. I do think that there's something about the attention span and the shortening of the attention span that's driven by our social media ecosystem, by video gaming, by a whole bunch of things. And it's a real problem. And so one of the things that I think that we have to do is first of all, we've got to raise our game. We've got to become better storytellers. We have to think about how to also become better storytellers in the venues where young people especially are actually willing to go and consume information. I've been like telling my students, we got to figure out a way to do, like, try to figure out a way to become investigative storytellers on like TikTok, or can we invent that? Can we invent something new as a way to begin getting our stories in places and in forms and in some fashion that young people will actually crave to read and consume. But I don't pretend to have the overall larger answer, and in part it's because you feel like we're, these giant tectonic plates that are shaping our culture and are shaping our economies, and they're doing so in ways that I do think discourage young people from seeing things like being able to discern the difference between like the New York Times and the Washington. Yes, of course, we get things wrong, and we're human beings, and we're not the be all and end all. But I do know that there's a difference between those organizations that are doing their level best to like actually get to facts and describe the world as it is, versus those outlets that are like totally engaged in disinformation and misinformation. And the problem is that the way Facebook operates and the way YouTube operates, there's this tendency to kind of flatten out the differences between those entities. And that's, I mean, if I don't mean to be a downer about this, but that's one of the reasons why I'm not like particularly optimistic about whether or not we'll ultimately triumph here. But you know what? I'm going to fight like hell to the bitter end as long as I've got energy, in hopes that something will shift in some larger way.
Thank you,
David. Peter, you want to ask a question, don't you?
Thank you, Alex. David, when I go out to meet media students, first question I always ask is, how many of you have read a newspaper today? Then the second question I ask is, how many of you read a newspaper in the last week? And if I get one or two hands going up, I actually feel that's fairly good. So that is really a problem. But the second point I'd make is, when I take the tram into work in the morning, I look over the shoulder of all the people on their mobile phones, and I would say they spend on average between 5 and 10 seconds deciding if something is worth reading. So literally you have 1 or 2 sentences to convince the reader that there's something worthwhile. It's just impossible to get across complex ideas, investigative reports, if you only have 5 or 10 seconds to grab that person's attention. So it is a real problem. And that is, I know optimists say it doesn't matter what platform journalism is on, it's just the journalism that counts. But getting people to pay attention on mobile platforms is much harder than in print. And I know myself, if I read a newspaper and I don't have time to read something in depth, I'll put it aside, and I may well come back to it in the evening, and I may well enjoy it in the evening, have more time in the evening to deal with it. But if I only have 5 or 10 seconds to capture your attention, it's just impossible to engage in proper investigative journalism.
Yeah, it's so funny. For 20 years, I took a bus into New York City every day, and I did the same thing that you do. I'd sort of look at, first of all, does anyone have a newspaper, and who's looking at the newspaper, and yes, absolutely. Over time, you saw, eventually everyone was just looking at their phones, and they were doing exactly what, I mean, we've all seen this, right? It's swipe, 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 swipe. So yes, you can get really depressed about that. However, However, on the other hand, and this is something that I certainly cling to for when I'm feeling really dark and depressed. The numbers also show that when you deliver a really great piece of investigative reporting, the numbers show and the metrics show that actually huge audiences are in fact flocking to those stories in particular. And they also show that the engagement times are much, much higher with those stories. And so you don't, yes, no, I mean, it's a long ways from reaching, everybody, but actually it does show, and in fact, the story that Trump is suing me over, which was, I think it was the longest story that, I believe it's the longest story that ever was published in the news pages of the New York Times, 14,000 words. There was a very funny satire that was put out here yesterday in response to the lawsuit, and it was a picture of Donald Trump reading the New York Times, and the caption was the story that Donald Trump began reading in 2018. He just finished and realized was total crap. And it was making fun of how long the stupid story was. But what's interesting is that actually, and this is one of the, like, when we didn't just publish that 14,000 word story, we also did like a tweet storm about that 14,000 word story. We also did a podcast about that 14,000 word story. We also did a summary of that 14,000 word story. And then one of the things that always matters to me, and it's something that I looked to, was I looked specifically at how many of the late night comedy TV shows, like Jimmy Kimmel and Saturday Night Live, how many of them use the story to like make a joke and to make fun of Trump. And I remember that week we pulled off something that I had never achieved in my career, which was every single comedy late night show did a riff off of that 14,000 word story. And so when you look at it in that way, it turns out that these, like, yes, they're very long, and I don't know I can go back and find out the total number of people who read all 14,000 words. But what I know for a fact is that within a week, that story had really seeped into the sort of culture and the firmament of political consciousness widely in the United States, and it did so because of the fact that it was entering the kind of the ecosystem through all of these different delivery points. And so, like, you can imagine, like, the audience for Saturday Night Live is millions of people, and a lot of them are young people. And so maybe that's all they got, right, from the story, was the Saturday Night Live did this really funny bit about Donald Trump and his money. But you know what? Those writers are really good at getting to the sort of the heart of the matter, and then summarizing it in a way that ultimately sinks in. So I think that, I mean, I know that it's certainly my approach, and I think it should be all of our approaches, to be thinking about how on earth do we use all of these different tools and techniques that are at our disposal to get to people where they live. And yes, hopefully, you'll get some people who will well, it turns out you get a pretty significant audience that is hungry for what I call the sort of the 16-ounce ribeye steak of a story. And I think that's one of the reasons why you'll see in the United States, for sure, in newsrooms, there's been an increasing investment in investigative reporting. even as there's been a disinvestment in other forms of reporting, is because editors are seeing those numbers that I'm just describing.
Thanks, David. Louis, you have a question.
Yeah. Hello, David. Nice seeing you. I would be interested what effect, in your opinion, did 5 years of Donald Trump have on the media policy in the US? Do you think it's getting better now that he's gone, or are there other politicians who continue this handling with media or the handling against media?
So, as I mentioned earlier, he clearly has had an impact on public opinion. In the number of people in the United States who support the idea of a free press has been going down, and it will, and there's plenty of other politicians coming right behind, who will continue those attacks on the idea of a free press in the United States. However, in terms of like actual policy, in terms of like changing laws or court decisions, on that front, very little has changed. And one thing I would say is that in some ways, I was actually more concerned about, in terms of policy, I was actually more concerned about what was happening under the Obama administration. The Obama administration pursued a very aggressive campaign to prosecute whistleblowers who were leaking to journalists. And the Obama administration was actually more aggressive and brought more of these kinds of prosecutions against whistleblowers than the Trump administration had. And it was really having a profound impact on the ability of reporters to write about, for example, the war on terror and other kind of national security issues. And the Obama administration was in their kind of really aggressive pursuit and prosecution of whistleblowers, was also edging toward this idea that reporters themselves are acting criminally if they encourage whistleblowers to give information to them. And so that this actually has a connection, right, to this case that Trump has brought against us, which is like this idea that we acted somehow improperly in basically doing the kind of reporting that has been done here for many, many decades. So like I was actually much more concerned about like policy and law and how that would affect the kind of work that I do under the Obama White House than I was under the Trump White House. Not because, I mean, I know that if Trump could, he would totally rewrite, for example, libel laws to make it much easier for public officials to sue journalists. But like he didn't actually, like he said that and he was loud and repeated that over and over and over again, but he actually didn't do anything. And there was no kind of political momentum to rewrite libel laws in the United States during his 5 years on the scene. So I mean, yeah, it's an interesting paradox. I mean, Trump did a lot more damage in terms of public support for a free press, but actually Obama was no great prize in terms of like in terms of the policies that he pursued. And I consider that to be a really major blemish on the Obama years.
Ruth, it's your turn.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, David, for sharing your points of view about the US media context, so different from, in some aspects, from the European context where we are most of us. I would like to ask you regarding this idea of investigative reporting, if you think the fact-checking platforms are, in a sense, examples of investigative reporting. Okay. Another question that I would like to ask you, when you are teaching and you are with your students, what will be the qualities that you think the students should have to be good investigative reporters? Okay. And I'm very happy you are optimistic and you think the investigative reporting is just in a good moment, because sometimes from the European context, where it's not so common to have investigative reporters or so many resources, as Alex was saying before. Well, I hope, or we hope, that the resources, or just the possibilities, will increase in the upcoming years, because it's evident that the responsibility of media and the key role of media is important, the investigative process and the investigative methodologies and this type of information. So I hope the European context will also have good examples and more examples of this type of journalism in the future. So regarding that, fact-checking platforms, I would like to know your opinion about that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, it's an easy one for me. Yes, of course, fact-checking can absolutely involve investigative reporting and should be considered. Especially, I mean, a lot of times it's very, it takes classic investigative reporting techniques in order to get to the truth of the matter, and then to say, look, here are the facts, and this is what's true. So yeah, I have huge respect for fact-checking outfits. And I think their work is really important, and I hope they continue to proliferate. On your second question, so I think what I'm looking for is basically two essential traits, and I think to do this work and to do it well, there's really only two essential ingredients. And I think one is abnormal curiosity, and I think the other is relentless persistence. And I think if you have abnormal curiosity and relentless persistence, you can do this work incredibly well. And if you're missing those, either of those ingredients, you really will struggle to do this work well. You don't have to be the smartest, you don't have to be the best writer, you don't have to be, but if you've got to be the kind of person who who is just always asking why and how and why, the kind of person who just annoys the hell out of your family because you're always asking why. The kind of person who just drove your parents nuts because you're just always asking why. I mean, that you've got to have this real, just this deep hunger to understand the world. And then the other thing, you can't be a person who gives up, right? I mean, we don't carry guns, we don't carry badges, we don't have subpoena power. All we have is, kind of our absolute determination and optimism to get into spaces that are closed to us, so that we can shed light on things that are otherwise secret. And that takes someone who is incredibly resilient, and it's just always going to be sitting there and saying, there's got to be a way. There's just got to be a way. Whose door do I have to knock on? What phone number do I have to call? How do I, that sort of that drive, right? That's sort of the combination of curiosity and persistence. If you have those two things, and I think those are I noticed that at least among the best investigative reporters who I've encountered in my life, I see those qualities just pouring out of them. And I've seen that over many decades. So I think those are the two two things that I look for, the two critical ingredients. Does that answer your question?
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, for being with us. It is always a great pleasure. And I can assure you once again that we are with you and we support you in any way we can. And also the people from the press councils, they are romantic people and they are fighting for the facts and for the truth and for ethical journalism. I mean, we have had interesting discussions. I remember the second time we met in New York, you were skeptical about press councils and you said it's kind of interfering with freedom of the press. And we had many, many discussions on specific cases, but somehow I think you learned also something about the press councils through our meetings and conferences. And you can see now, I guess, at least you will tell us maybe, but you can see that there is a point of having a press council. Maybe if you would have one in the US, then Trump could go there, but probably
he would be going to the press council right now. Alex.
No, but probably he would have said that also the press council is the enemy of the people, I suppose, because we are very independent, and generally speaking, I have the impression that he doesn't like independent institutions so much. So I'm not sure if that would have helped, but yeah, I'm really happy that we could speak to you and that you were talking about the recent developments, and I'm sure you will go through it, and I don't see too much chances for Trump to win this lawsuit, but of course
well, if he does, you guys know where to send money, so
yeah, okay. The problem is that the press councils, they are also always having a
financial
budget problem, but we will see.
Listen, keep up the good fight, everybody over there, and I really hope to see you all again in person at some point down the road.
Yeah, hopefully you come back to Austria, to Europe, and then we organize it with Franz Klammer, because you're a big fan of this.
Yeah, I'm a huge goal,
Franz. And when we went to Tyrol last time, they said that they can organize something. So let's see. Let's hope that the pandemic.
I'm noticing that Edwin has long hair now.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, happened, right.
That's cool.
Is that your COVID look?
Yeah, that's work of 2 years.
He is very cautious, which is good. He doesn't go to the hairdresser anymore, you know.
Well, it was great to visit with all of you, and Olga, it was great to see you, and Edwin, great to see you, and we'll hope to see you all down the road.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
David.
All the best, David. Yeah.
You too.
So all of you have a good evening. We will restart tomorrow at 9 o'clock.